Hi everyone, here we are again for Ways of the World, a brief global history with sources. We're going to start our study of colonial encounters in Asia, Africa, and Oceania with industry and empire. So let's start with the Imperial Durbar of 1903. So to mark the coronation of British monarch Edward VII and his installation as the Emperor of India, colonial authorities in India mounted an elaborate assembly, or Durbar. The Durbar was intended to showcase the splendor of the British Empire, and its pageantry included sporting events, a state ball, a huge display of Indian arts and crafts and jewels, and an enormous parade in which a long line of British officials and Indian princes passed by on bejeweled elephants. So how does the painting and its description help explain the power Europeans exerted over their colonies? Well, this painting demonstrates the wealth of imperial power, in this case that of the British, emphasized through a spectacle the audience would be familiar with and thus understand. Moreover, positioning is key. The British colonial administrators sit atop the largest, foremost elephant, while most Indians are situated below or beneath them. All right, the Industrial Revolution fueled much of Europe's expansion. The demand for raw materials and agricultural products was important, and there's a need for markets for Europeans to sell their products. European capitalists often invested money abroad, and foreign markets kept workers within Europe employed. And the growth of mass nationalism in Europe made imperialism broadly popular. Italy and Germany united by 1871, and colonies were a status symbol. So industrial age developments made overseas expansion possible. Steamships, underwater telegraph, quinine, and breech-loading rifles and machine guns. Now, the Europeans' perception of the quote-unquote other changed during the period of industrialization. In the past, Europeans had largely defined others in religious terms, but the industrial age promoted a secular arrogance among Europeans. It was sometimes combined with the sense of religious superiority. Now, the European opinion of other cultures dropped. The image of quote-unquote John Chinaman as cunning and deceitful fed quote-unquote yellow peril, anxiety. Africans were always seen as primitive, and Pacific Islanders as big children. And this is a new kind of racism called scientific racism, with the hierarchy of races, with Europeans always on top. And there's a sense of responsibility to the quote-unquote weaker races. Europeans believed it was their duty to civilize them and bring them education, healthcare, Christianity, good government, etc. It was regarded as quote-unquote progress and quote-unquote civilization, and thus termed social Darwinism, and that was an effort to apply Darwin's evolutionary theory to human history. All right, colonial rivalries. This image shows Africa as a sleeping giant, while various European countries stake their rival claims to the parts of the continent. It was published in 1911 in Puck, a British magazine of humor and satire. So how could a historian use this political cartoon to explain European attitudes toward African societies during the age of imperialism? Well, the cartoon suggests that Europeans viewed Africans as a monolithic group, meaning that they were one culturally unified people rather than a series of distinct communities, and that their land could be divided up like a pasture or field in Europe without the permission of the ambivalent African people shown here as the sleeping giant. European racial images. This 19th century chart depicting the quote-unquote progressive development of man from apes to modern Europeans reflected the racial categories that were so prominent at the time. It also highlights the influence of Darwin's evolutionary ideas as they were applied to varieties of human beings. So what contributed to changing European views of Asians and Africans in the 19th century? Well, the accomplishments of the Industrial Revolution, including the unlocking of the secrets of nature and the creation of a society that enjoyed unprecedented wealth, led Europeans to develop a secular arrogance that fused with, or in some cases replaced, their long-standing notions of religious superiority. Increasingly, Europeans viewed the culture and achievements of Asian and African peoples through the prism of a new kind of racism, expressed now in terms of modern science. Europeans used allegedly scientific methods to classify humans, concluding that Europeans were more advanced, and collectively these studies created a hierarchy of race, with Europeans on top and less developed or quote-unquote child races beneath them. And the belief among Europeans that they were the superior race led to a future set of ideas that European expansion was inevitable and that Europeans were fated to dominate the quote-unquote weaker races. They saw it as their duty to undertake a civilizing mission that included bringing Christianity to the heathens, quote-unquote heathens, good government to disordered lands, work discipline and production for the markets to the natives, a measure of education to the ignorant and illiterate, clothing to the naked, and healthcare to the sick, while at the same time suppressing native customs that ran counter to Western ways of living. The idea of social Darwinism made imperialism, war, and aggression in Africa and Asia seem both natural and progressive. They served to weed out the weaker peoples of the world, allowing the stronger to flourish. So evaluate how Europeans would use these new views toward non-European societies in order to separate themselves from their colonial subjects in Asia and Africa. When the era of imperialism, Europeans developed systems to justify their cultural superiority, either by depicting others using negative qualities, for example, the Chinese as weak and cunning, or as quote-unquote big children for those peoples in Oceania. And this racism, artificially supported by science, it reinforced the view that Europeans should imperialize for the non-Europeans' own good. And that concludes our study of industry and empire. I will see you guys for a second wave of European conquest.